The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
I'm very excited to see Rob Shaw and Richard Zussman writing a book on BC politics because they're as rare as hen's teeth, number one, and for number two, they're both great journalists. They'll do a great job. Everybody buy that book.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and I can tell you that here in the provincial capital of British Columbia, there is no greater buzz these days than the excitement over this book. A Matter of Confidence. Am I holding it right? Yes, I am holding it right side up. A Matter of Confidence. And the authors themselves are on the show tonight to tell the story of how they came to write this book about last year in BC politics and what's in the book. Welcome to the show, Richard Zussman.
Hey, Vaughn.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
And welcome to the show, Rob Shaw.
Thanks for having me on.
You here. Yeah. So the question that has been asked of more authors and more interview shows in the entire known history of the universe, why did you write this book?
Yeah, we have a pretty good genesis story, I think.
Yeah.
I know you're a lover of books, especially about BC politics. And when I moved here to the capital, I went to every used bookstore I could find in Sydney and Victoria. You know the stores well. I did the same in Metro Vancouver looking for books about BC politics. I probably should have just come to your office first. But I went and looked everywhere I could to look for these books, and I realized there just weren't a lot of books about contemporary BC politics. Basically, there are some about Mike Harcourt. There's the book that Gary Mason and Keith Baldry did about Van der Zam. But sort of the closer you get to current day, there just aren't a lot of books. So I sort of asked around the gallery to see if anybody would be interested in writing a Gordon Campbell book. It didn't seem like anybody was that interested in that idea. And then we got into this election cycle before the 2017 election, and we got busy covering that, and it was so incredible and exciting. And we went through the election, and it was basically a tie, and then the Green NDP and Liberal negotiations, and then we got to the confidence vote. And when it was all done, I thought to myself, somebody needs to write this book. And if nobody's going to do it, I'm going to do it. But I'm not a good enough writer to do it. So I need to find a guy who's a good enough writer. So my friend Rob Shaw was upstairs one day, and I remember still running up the stairs and going up to him and go, we got to write a book, and you have to do it with me. And I'm very lucky that he said yes.
If only we'd known.
Yeah, right. I'm just a lowly broadcaster, and I needed a guy with as much talent as Rob has. And so...
But this is like 100,000 words.
A little bit more.
Which you two wrote in like 8 weeks.
Well, the book publishing world was very tight at the time we did it. So we did 70 interviews, and our initial draft is 130,000 words in 8 weeks, in August and September. We had to have it done by the start of October. And it was a very awkward time, if you remember. Everyone was still very raw. The NDP had just assumed power. The Liberals were still smarting. Clark had just been forced out. We got a lot of, I think, emotion, and we got a lot of vivid present detail, but a little bit of hesitancy, I think, as well. So we had to kind of deal with all those as we interviewed people.
You talked to everybody. What were the ground rules?
So the interviews were on background. I think we have to give credit to Christy Clark right up front because she agreed right from the beginning to be part of it, and there was a lot of people, and the full list is in the front of our book, who have never spoken to the media before, insiders and political staff, and they wouldn't have done it if she hadn't had said, it's okay for people to talk to the authors. So we have to give her credit for that background. And then in the case of the Christy Clark, Jorn Horgan, Andrew Weaver, we talked to them about the quotes we were going to use, and everything everyone ever said to us is in that book in one form or another, jammed into 320 some odd pages.
It was really amazing that almost everyone we asked to be a part of it said yes. The only one, and we mentioned this in there, was Gordon Campbell. We asked him many times to be interviewed for the book. He turned us down. There were a few others who didn't want to be involved, but we were amazed with how most people really wanted to get behind this project. Rob mentioned that without Christy Clark's blessing, a lot of them wouldn't have done it. The same for Jorn Horgan. We had support from the NDP as well, and so a lot of those operatives who worked in and around the NDP leading up to the election and through the election agreed to do interviews as well. So we had a lot of support from the both of them, which was really, really helpful in putting together this book. But I really was amazed with how people were quite open. And I think everybody wants to have their voice set in stone in terms of history, right? They want their opinion to be known. It's funny how you can have a meeting of two people, but the two of them had very differing opinions of how that meeting went. So we did our best job at getting to the closest, I guess, resemblance of the truth as we possibly could.
And Gordon Campbell is actually in the book. You'll find him in there using the F word at one point. A very vivid quote from him. So the book starts back at sort of the end of Campbell. It is mostly about what happened in 2019, but to get there, you need Horgan, you need Clark, you need what happened with Campbell, you need the HST and some other stuff, Weaver as well. Last week on Voice of BC, if you folks watched, it was an interview with Jorn Horgan, Premier of British Columbia. And it's really one of the most interesting chapters in the book, and I think even people who know Horgan might, or even the people who voted for Horgan, might be surprised when they read it. It's a chapter called "The Man Who Did Not Want to Be Premier." What's the story?
Yeah, I mean, when you go back and look at John Horgan's trajectory to the leading the NDP, there was a period after the 2013 election. Everyone thought the NDP was going to win. They lost. Adrian Dix stepped down as leader, announced he was going to, and no one basically really wanted that job. There was a kind of a tepid leadership race, and John Horgan was out. He said, I don't want to be part of it. This isn't going to be very much fun. I have a big mouth, and I say some things every now and again, and I want to be free to say them. And he had to be coaxed into it, and we chronicled kind of the behind-the-scenes coaxing. He was worried he was going to get painted as the angry guy by the Liberals. He was unsure if he had the right team and the right platform. And right up until basically before the election, there was a lot of doubt in John Horgan's mind, including a moment where with David Eby and with the party, where he even offered to step down if they thought they could find someone better, right before the election. And he didn't, and we know he's now in the Premier's office. So it's quite an unlike Christy Clark, I think a lot of people see in her a pursuit of power. John Horgan didn't pursue it the same way. He was far less aggressive in wanting to lead his party.
Yeah. I think you're right. When Clark arrived in Victoria in 1996, we used to joke that her website was www.christyforpremier.com. She was very ambitious. Are you struck by the transformation with Horgan now in government?
Yeah, I think it's one of the incredible things, not just in working on the book, but as working journalists. I have this very vivid memory, and it was in one of the early drafts of the book and was taken out because of space. But I went and played disc golf with him a week before the election campaign in 2017. And it was a chance for them to showcase who John Horgan was as a guy. I met his wife. We did an interview with his wife. And we played disc golf and had lunch. And sort of he wanted to showcase who he was so British Columbians could get to know him. And then we walked out to the vehicle and we were chit-chatting like you do at the end of these interviews. And he said to me he was really nervous. He was nervous about going on the road. He was nervous about being away from his wife. He was nervous about not having dinner at 6 o'clock at night because he knows he gets grumpy when he doesn't eat his 3 meals at the same time. And to me, it was really just a guy. Like a guy who was about to go through a really tough month where he was interviewing for a job that at the time I wasn't so sure, and I don't think he was so sure he wanted. And as you watch those weeks unfold through the campaign and that pivotal moment in the radio debate where Christy Clark touched his arm and he lashed out at her and all the sort of old John tendencies seemed to be creeping back. And then after that, he gained some momentum in the election night and then through the negotiations. And you could see a guy who was getting more comfortable in his own skin. He was getting more comfortable showing British Columbians who he was. And I hope people get the impression in the book. You know, we have moments in that book about his temper, which have been well documented, and how he really reined that in. And I think the epilogue at the end of the book really finishes really nicely in the sense that it talks about how now, it was from his year-end interviews in December, and how he now feels like he can be John, that he can govern that way. Yeah. And I think that's a great, Rob describes him the right way, right? We've seen this incredible evolution of a human being into somebody who's very comfortable in, you know, what is the most important job in this province.
And he's been in politics long enough that he knows that you can get into a lot of trouble, and maybe the old John will come back some days out of frustration, but it is a fascinating story, one of several in the book. Another thing that's really interesting about this book and important about this book, I read a lot of books about BC politics. There aren't a lot of them, but I've read most of them, is this one lifts the lid on something that we know almost nothing about, which is what goes on at Government House when a premier goes and sits down and talks to the lieutenant governor about her future or his future. There's a whole chapter in the book on that. I got a good question here on it from Andrew McLeod of the Tyee. Here's Andrew.
One of the parts of this story is that after Christy Clark lost the confidence vote in the legislature, she advised the lieutenant governor that she should call another election, send British Columbia back to the polls. How big a deal is it that the lieutenant governor ignored that advice?
I think it's a pretty big deal. I think it's doesn't happen very often in parliamentary systems around the world. I think one of my favorite parts in the book is this theory that is out there, and Clark still doesn't believe it to be true, but we put it in the book, and what it is that you'll remember that incredible day in Government House. Clark was in there for more than an hour and a half. People were waiting around the province saying, wow, she must really be convincing Lieutenant Governor Judith Guichon that she has to call an election or she has to do something. Where what we found out through the book is she was only in with Guichon for about 40 minutes. A lot of that was just spent chit-chatting. They were enjoying wine. And then Clark went and did damage control. But the pivotal moment is when she walked out of Government House, stood in front of the cameras, and said that Guichon had retired for the evening, and then left. And the idea is, if she had actually walked out and said, I've asked the Lieutenant Governor to call an election, and I've handed her my resignation letter, then the Lieutenant Governor may have been forced to make a different decision. And, politics, the what ifs, I think is one of the great things about talking about politics. And so to Andrew's question, it is very significant that Guichon turned her down, but it made Guichon's job really easy when Clark didn't go and tell the public exactly what she did.
And Guichon was sitting inside watching a live stream of Clark coming out and talking to the media.
She hadn't retired.
She had not retired, and that was maybe a mistake by Clark, although she doesn't believe that. She thinks that, and we detail the back and forth in the room, and the way it kind of went is Clark went in there, she brought a 3-page letter written by Mike DeYoung, her veteran House leader, and it outlined in detail why the House wasn't workable in the current format. Guichon took it, put it aside, didn't even read it. And Clark turned on the charm offensive. She used every argument she had, and she didn't get much of an uptake from the Lieutenant Governor. It was a lot of silence, not a lot of questions, and she knew. She's a very good reader of people. I mean, you can say that about Christy Clark. She knows how to interact with people, and she knew that she wasn't going to get through to the LG. So from her point of view, she doesn't think she made a mistake. Others suggest that had she been more upfront from the beginning, maybe even before going to Government House, that she intended to ask the LG for an election and not try to dance around different options. And she spent a lot of time trying to tell people she wasn't going to do that, but she was, but not quite, but sort of. Then maybe that would have tilted the LG towards doing it. But we'll never know because she didn't do it.
As a matter of record, on the 30th of May, Christy Clark twice during a press conference said she had no intention of seeking another election. She said it twice. I've talked to someone on her staff who thinks that was a terrible mistake because she then spent the next month trying to take back that statement and contrive to force an election. In any event, Richard's right. It almost never happens in our system that a lieutenant governor rejects the advice of the first minister and instead accepts the first minister's resignation. In this case they did. Again, the account of what happens on Horgan's side of the House and the legislature is really good too. It's a great book in that way as well. Let's jump to the next question. Jock Finlayson.
Other than the election outcome itself, what was the most surprising feature of the 2017 campaign in your view?
You both talk in your book about how it almost reversed 2013. That it was the New Democrats who were sort of stand pat in 2013, very aggressive, and the Liberals, well, a variation on their I mean, it was a very lackluster campaign.
And that's the problem with 16 years, right? Is the criticism will be if you come up with great new ideas, everyone will say, where have these ideas been while you've been in government? It was a weird campaign. You know, all of us, the three of us were in Vancouver. We were following around the campaigns, traveling a little bit with the campaign teams, and it was hard to get any momentum. I think the one thing is the I Am Linda story, and it's chronicled in the book as well. And
This
not
is a woman
because
who
of its
comes up to
significance.
Clark.
Exactly. So she approaches Christy Clark in a grocery store in North Vancouver. She has a quick conversation with Clark, 8 seconds long, says to Clark she's never going to vote for her. Clark says, good, that's why we live in a democracy. And Linda responds, I hope you don't get back in. Conversation over. And then the video got posted online. It got viewed 500,000 times in the span of a day. People were saying, this is Christy Clark just brushing aside the public. The other argument was, well, you know, you're not going to agree with everybody. Then the Liberals went on the offensive and said Linda was a plant. She'd been hired by the NDP to derail Clark. And all of this just became a huge distraction. And I interviewed Linda at the time. I interviewed her as well for the book. And part of the story was the fact that she wasn't a plant. And I had sent messages to people, anyone that would listen to the Liberals, and said, you know what, guys, just cut this out. It's not true. And they doubled down and they kept pushing, and that became the story. And for a whole week, and the reason I bring it up is because the campaign was so dull in a sense that this story lingered for a week. It was a nothing story, really, but Clark had to answer questions every day for a week about this and didn't allow her to get to her message. And so, you know, she makes the point, Clark does in the book, or we make the point for her, that she still believes to this day that Linda Higgins is a plant. And they still believe that it had an impact on their election fortunes. And I think that's a really strange take, but one of those things that sticks out of my mind from the election.
You also tell the story of how Horgan was staffed so well and worked with his staff so well that there were some flutters for him, but for the most part, it was an amazing performance in an election campaign.
Yeah, I think there's a number of differences between the two campaigns, and one is the staff. There was one guy in charge of the NDP campaign, and his name was Bob Dewar, and he made it clear from the beginning that he was the guy running the campaign, and Horgan had to back him up. And he made a number of calls in that campaign, including one about bridge tolls, which we chronicle, where the NDP moved quickly, decisively, and in some cases invented policy in a matter of hours, including the decision to scrap bridge tolls, invented one morning within 300 minutes between seeing the Liberals move on bridge tolls and announcing that the NDP were scrapping them entirely. And that was the work of a lean campaign team run by one person. The Liberals had a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of people who helped Christy Clark win in 2013 when everyone thought she was going to lose. And you get this kind of impression that maybe the NDP actually, in a weird way, had a fresher campaign. They borrowed Christy Clark's Families First agenda. They ran on a grandiose idea like her former LNG vision, and they left the Liberals sitting there arguing for more of the same and a stand-pat campaign. And it was kind of an interesting reversal of the campaigns of the past.
The book tackles something that was unusual enough in BC politics. Our second woman as premier and the first one to win a full term of government and then, well, sort of win an election. We'll argue forever over what happened in that election, but she did get the most votes and the most seats. And the book takes up that very issue. There's a whole chapter in there on that. Let's go to a question from Jamie Lawson to set it up. Here he is.
At different times during the election and the run-up to it, there were clear indications that gender issues were playing out in interesting ways between the three major leaders of the BC parties. And yet it doesn't seem to have exploded out into matter that really dominated the elections. To what extent are we looking at a couple of guys who both play rugby ganging up on a woman politician in such a way that it was difficult for her to maintain credibility as premier? And to what extent is that really actually a sideline issue in what played out in 2017?
Well, it's a good question. I think, and we do put a whole chapter behind this subject, I think you could make that argument. I think gender was a big part of the election campaign, but it didn't work in the Liberals' favor. And we explore how, in the book, how Christy Clark broke so many glass ceilings. It was a trailblazer really for women in leadership, brought a number of high-profile women into her government, did not get any credit for it. And because the public had a very visceral reaction to Christy Clark, and she was incredibly unpopular amongst women, a lot of her sympathies and messaging on the gender issue fell on deaf ears. And I think you saw it in the campaign where Jorn Horgan landed himself in a lot of trouble. And you, Richard, you mentioned it, the touching of the arm incident, the being very angry. And with a different candidate, that would have, I think, exploded in a much different way. But there was enough personal, intense, visceral dislike of Christy Clark, and that it didn't pick up. People didn't feel sorry for her. They ended up feeling like Jorn Horgan was a passionate fighter for their cause. And it's a fascinating dynamic, I think, and one that we explore a little bit. She faced an enormous amount of hurdles as a female leader. People who went into meetings with her and looked at her male staff, didn't talk to her, people commenting on her clothes and her appearance. It was very difficult for her, but she did not get a lot of public grace for it, and that's because she was a divisive figure. And for some people, they just refused to see sympathy in the way she was treated.
I was also a bit surprised through the campaign that Horgan and Weaver did not go after Clark more together, as Jamie described it there. I really felt like Weaver went after Horgan, and that's where he needed to go to get his votes. So I felt at times that Clark and Weaver were going after Horgan at the same time, because that's electorally, I think, where they both needed to position themselves. So, we address those issues of gender in politics. I think there's other examples. Clark's dealt with it a long time. Carol James also dealt with it as leader, and I think it's something that there is a greater challenge, I think, for a female leader than most men deal with in politics.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC. We'll be right back with the authors. See you in a minute.
In the 2017 election, the NDP had the worst showing they've ever had outside of the Lower Mainland. And we've seen 3 elections in a row, the NDP's percentage of the popular vote drop and their seat count drop in BC's interior and north. Union towns that used to reliably vote NDP have now been BC Liberal for several elections and growing. This is an unreported story from the last election that the NDP is in trouble outside of the Lower Mainland. And in the future, if the NDP loses some seats in Surrey, it'll be hard to see how they come back to form a government.
I'm Jorn Horgan, and it's Thursday night. Popcorn? Check. Cold beverage? Check. Comfortable chair? Check. Voice of BC? I'm ready to go.
Where there are no bars, there's freedom. It's where we find the strongest connections. And power we never knew we had. It's not always easy. And sometimes you wonder what you got yourself into. But when the stars are your compass, you tend to find your way.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
It's been a good year for books out of the British Columbia legislature. First was Craig McInnes's book on Ted Hughes. Now this one from Rob Shaw and Richard Zussman on the election result and what went into it. Soon you'll have Sarah Cox's book on Site C, and I have one coming out this spring on how to maximize the health of the maximum number of people. I think there'll be a lot of people who are interested in BC politics who will have a lot of reading to do over the summer.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. We were talking about some of the dynamic between Christy Clark and the other two leaders in the race. One of the, to me, really interesting things in the book is that it talks about just how nasty the New Democrats were to the Greens, particularly behind the scenes, the degree to which they were really targeted the Greens. And in fact, I think there's a story in there at one point where the Greens are breaking down in tears on their campaign bus because the NDP is being so mean to them. And yet, of course, we know what happens now. They end up as partners in sharing power and governing British Columbia. Question about all that, Andrew MacLeod of the Tyee. Here's Andrew.
With the Green Party holding the balance of power, there was a period after the election where there was some uncertainty about whether they would support the Liberals or the NDP. In their public statements, it sounded like they could go either direction. I'm wondering if, in your view, there was ever a serious possibility that they would have supported Christy Clark and the Liberals to remain in government.
The answer is yes to Andrew. I think Andrew Weaver wanted to support the Liberals, and we detailed that in the book. I think we do a pretty good job at tick-tocking throughout the negotiations, and there was a real sentiment that walking into the negotiations, Weaver wanted to support the Liberals. He thought that Jorn Horgan and the NDP did a terrible job in their first meeting. He described Horgan as disinterested. He described the team, the negotiating team, as not putting anything interesting forward. There was a lot of animosity coming out of the campaign. You mentioned that story. It's in the book in terms of these staffers. They're in Kelowna. One of the ridings that the Greens sort of thought they had a outside shot at when they started gaining momentum. They went to Kelowna and they heard these stories there about the NDP staffers attacking them behind the scenes. In one case, in Cowichan Valley, hiring someone, posting an ad online to pay them to attack the Greens constantly on social media, through editorials to the newspaper, letters to the editor. So there was a lot of discouragement, and these staffers just started crying on the bus, just so broken down by the fact that they felt attacked from this party that they actually thought they agreed with on a lot of things. So go forward now to these negotiations, and those feelings are still there. There's a lot of frustration. I think Weaver felt that Horgan picked on him during the election. He felt this animosity towards him, in a sense. You know, an earlier question, Jamie Lawson's question about the rugby guys. I think one of the things with Weaver and Horgan is they are pretty similar in some ways. I think they have some similar tendencies, although the book details their characteristics are different, but they have similarities, and I think that creates animosity in a sense. So there was a real sense there that Weaver wanted to support them. Sonia Furstenau didn't, and one of the really interesting, I think, funny parts of the book is about that. I won't spoil it just yet.
To the next question. Okay,
I won't spoil that.
Stop. Let's do the next question. This is a $1 million question. Everyone was waiting to see whether these guys were going to actually find out if this actually happened. So here with the question is Jordan Bateman.
Rob and Richard, one of the persistent rumors in BC Liberal land is that Green MLA Sonia Furstenau got actually physically ill at the mere suggestion that the Green Party support Christy Clark's government. In all of your research for this book, did you find any truth to this rumor?
On page, Sonia Furstenau vomits, right?
That's right. It's the start of one of the chapters, the Green DP chapter. It outlines the immense pressure that the Greens were under. They're getting thousands and thousands of emails and letters from their supporters saying, how could you even think of supporting the Liberals? Why are you even talking to them? And Sonia Furstenau in particular, she had this background at the Shawnigan Lake Quarry in her riding. She just grew to hate the Liberals over that. And she wasn't feeling well. She was stressed. I think she had some sushi. And one evening, in the beginning of the negotiations, she just ends up being physically ill. And it's one of those stories where we put it in the book. It was literally the Liberals' chances of a deal flushing away with Sonia Furstenau because she never came back on side. And Andrew Weaver, for all of his leanings towards the Liberals, and Richard outlined them, his working relationship with Christy Clark, of which he had a good one, he was unable to bring his caucus and his Green supporters on side to the idea of a Liberal deal. And so that is a correct, true rumor that was one of the impediments for that deal ever happening.
And there are also some policy issues. Weaver mentions climate, and we saw last week now this big change from the government around LNG, which has really frustrated Weaver because one of the breaking points was that Liberals, just weren't willing to move at all on any of these projects and on any of the climate targets or carbon pricing.
Okay, so here's the question. Did Dewar and Horgan figure out that Weaver and the Greens couldn't possibly go to the Liberals? And is that why they offered the Greens so little? Because if you look at the actual agreement that they signed, virtually everything in it is either in the NDP platform or it's the NDP version of what to do. The Greens wanted Site C killed. Site C got sent out for a study. The Greens had a target. The NDP did it. The Greens wanted proportional representation brought in. They ended up doing what the NDP wanted, a referendum. So the question is, Dewar's a pretty sharp guy, and so is Horgan. Did they realize that they didn't need to offer the Greens that much because really the Greens couldn't go to the Liberals?
Yeah, I think they figured that out, and I think they were right. I think they knew the public sentiment. I think they understood that the Greens would be decimated by public opinion if they decided to go to the Liberals. I think they understood how Sonia Furstenau felt.
Well, you have there's an anecdote in the book, Richard, about the Horgan and Furstenau meeting in the elevator, right?
Yeah.
And that was an example. Horgan took her to Starbucks and said to her right early in the negotiations, how could you think of supporting the Liberals after all they've done to you? So they very quickly clued in on the core of the issue.
And there's also, on the night of election night, Horgan says to Weaver, remember Rodney McIsaac. And he was the health researcher who committed suicide after the health firings. And for Horgan, that story is immensely personal, as well as for Health Minister Adrian Dix. And in opposition, they worked with these families and these fired workers very, very closely. And so it was these personal touches where I think the NDP was convinced there's no way, after what the Liberals did to so many people, in Horgan's mind, the Greens could support them.
You know, it's very interesting, folks, when you read this book, the degree to which personality ends up affecting events, history, personal history, animosity, all these things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But to me, you know, you write about politics all the time, you tend to divide stuff sometimes into ideological issues or things that parties have fought over for years. Amazing how much personality goes into it. Another good question. This one is from Bill Tillman. Here we go.
Rob and Richard, I wrote a column a while back, when I had a column, saying that Christy Clark had in one day destroyed the BC Liberal brand with their clone speech, talking about all the things they would do and completely giving up on their fiscal conservative heritage. How damaging do you think that was? You're hearing it in the legislature quoted back by NDP members to the Liberals right now. Can they get around it?
All copies of the Hansard with that speech in it have been collected and shredded.
Burned. First, we want to thank Bill. Bill was one of the guys we interviewed. He was extremely helpful in the early chapters around the HST. Also, a lot of the inner workings of the NDP in that era. So thanks to Bill for the help he gave us on the book. To his question, it's funny now, I chatted with a Liberal staffer who was interviewed for the book earlier this week about the book, and he said the thing that stood out to him in reading it was how many people are now trying to distance themselves from that speech that were very much involved in that speech. And we mentioned people's thoughts about how much, oh no, it wasn't me, it was someone else who was
off
involved.
that read.
Yeah. but that he laughs now and thinks maybe we let some people off the hook that were more involved in that speech than the book lets on.
Yeah, but there was, I mean, we have a quote in there from Mike de Jong saying to Christy Clark, you know, you're going all in. You were going all in with the throne speech, and there was an acknowledgement inside that it would be very difficult for her to serve as opposition leader if this gamble on a throne speech and the LG didn't result in a new election. And quite a few of her senior staff at the time, some of which were leaving, told other senior staff, and in some cases her, this is a bad move. But she had got to the point where she was surrounding herself with trusted advisors from the beginning of her political career as premier in 2013, and she was listening to very few voices at that point. And to her, I mean, it's her name. She's the premier, right? She has to. It's her legacy on if she decides to do that throne speech or not. And people just deferred to her ultimate judgment on it. And I don't think history is going to be kind in looking at that throne speech. Even the further afar we get away from it.
No, I think it's, you know, you start the book off with the HST and Gordon Campbell's destruction of his own political career that way. It's interesting how many political careers in this province end that way. You know, you don't get in 10 years and the leader says, oh, this is long enough, and retires with accolades and a statue on the front lawn. British Columbia, they tend to overstay their welcome and make complete asses of themselves in the last act of their political careers. But maybe that'll change with the current premier. We'll see. Let's go to this one. There's another good question about some of the background. We've talked some about the Greens, and we've talked some about the New Democrats. This is a question about the dynamic among the Liberals. Bruce Halser.
When Christy Clark came out of the wilderness to lead the BC Liberals, she had the support of only one member of caucus. In the year before her first election as premier, there was talk of a coup where she would be ousted. There was an expectation the Liberals were toast, and there was a lot of dissension in her caucus and in her cabinet. Do you think that dissension went away because of her victory, or do you think it festered there throughout the term, and do you think it contributed in any way to the Liberals' lack of direction and to their loss in 2017?
There was a pretty big cleansing after the 2013 election, and we detailed the stars that she recruited: Michelle Stilwell, a big one, Peter Fassbender, Todd Stone, and there was a big cleansing. But Bruce makes the really good, strong, valid point that there was a lot of problems in and before that election. But I think when Clark governed, she governed with the cabinet she wanted to after 2013, with the team she wanted to, and it was very much her premier's office and herself who were in control.
There was two issues, I think, with her cabinet. One was there's an urban-rural divide by the end of it, where it manifested itself in metro transit issues, for example. You had powerful cabinet ministers from the interior and the north just opposed to the idea of giving Metro Vancouver a break on transit. And that debate in her cabinet that the NDP managed to seize upon, because they went all in on transit in Metro Vancouver, and Clark's cabinet was divided on that. She was more conciliatory than Gordon Campbell and running a cabinet, but I think by the end, the Liberals had the problem of having MLAs across the whole province, and the NDP government right now doesn't have that problem. It doesn't have any interior or very few interior MLAs, so they don't need to worry about that. But Clark was trying to bring all these voices together, and it got tough for her near the end.
Yeah, like one of the big challenges is Todd Stone's your transportation minister, and we detailed this, and his biggest issues were Metro Vancouver issues: tolling, transit, ride sharing. And so you have this guy who has an experience in Kamloops and in the interior, and now all of a sudden you're getting him to deal with some of the most controversial and toughest issues in Metro Vancouver. And there are those around the cabinet table, Clark, Mike DeYoung, Rich Coleman, who live and breathe Metro Vancouver life, and they're saying different things. And so I think Rob hits it right on the head in terms of that dichotomy really, I think, hurt the cabinet structure and who was inputting ideas and who was actually being listened to.
But if you look at the two elections, the three elections, the 09 election right. with Campbell, then 13 and then 17, what you see is the Liberals being driven out of Metro Vancouver, because Clark lost her seat in Vancouver. They lost a seat even though they won the election in 2013, they lost seats in Vancouver, and the center of gravity shifted outside the city. So Coleman is from the Valley, DeYoung is from the Valley. Clark ends up having to go to the Okanagan to win a seat. Kamloops ends up with the health minister and the highways minister and half the budget. And I think there was some punishing of Vancouver that went on in the Clark government. I think one of the reasons they did so poorly in Metro was because to some degree, they downgraded the importance of Metro, even though, and that's where they lost 10 seats.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, the long fight over transit with Christy Clark just preferring to fight the mayors. And there were some cabinet ministers eventually at some point who said, look, we got to just figure the Metro thing out. But Clark wanted to fight with the mayors, and they fought with the mayors.
We'll take a brief break on Voice of BC with the authors of A Matter of Confidence. Stay with us.
Overwhelmingly, I believe that the track record of the BC Liberal Party while they were governing was an anti-environmental track record. They unraveled the majority of environmental laws in the province, and they did a lot of harm. The two places where they actually moved forward in a fairly significant way was in the introduction of the carbon tax and in some of the climate change policies for a fairly short duration, and also for the protection of a certain region, the Great Bear Rainforest, with significant levels of forest protection.
Forget Mansbridge, forget Cooper, forget Woodward, forget Bernstein. For incisive, insightful, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism, watch Vaughn Palmer on Voice of BC, Thursday nights. This is Mike DeYoung.
Help me run.
Help me go places.
Help me swim. How we give hugs.
If you're Bill Vander Zalm, you got to be getting nervous right about now. Right now, the BC political book Mount Rushmore includes Fantasyland by Mason and Baldry. It includes Mitchell's biography of W.A.C. Bennett. I think it includes Milky's Barbarians in the Garden City. And right now, it also includes Bill Vander Zalm's 1,000-page autobiography that he wrote shortly after leaving office. But Zussman and Shaw have come out with a book, A Matter of Confidence, and I think Bill Vander Zalm is about to get bumped off Mount Rushmore.
Bateman and I are probably the only two people in British Columbia that have read the entire 1,000-page Vander Zalm, other than Ted Hughes' lawyer, who had to read it when Ted sued Vander Zalm. But anyway, let's go to a blast from the past, the former leader of the Green Party, and a topical blast from the past, which opens the book, the HST. Here's Jane Sturt.
I understand that you had a backroom look at the HST and some of the other issues that have gone wrong in the province. I personally supported the HST. What do you think the Campbell government did wrong? And do you think that there would ever be an appetite in this province to implement a tax like the HST, which is much more fair and improved way of taxation?
Altogether now, no. However,
the
you
worst three
start
letters
off the book, Rob, with this story of Gordon Campbell winning his third term. Very few premiers have ever done it. Another big victory, and he goes back to his office, and the deputy finance minister walks in, and it's the end of his political career. Pretty much. That's pretty much sets it in motion. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, you know, what did Gordon Campbell do wrong on the HST? Pretty much everything. And the reason for the tax was that not at the beginning it was great tax policy. It was because he had promised during the recession, the beginning of the recession, a maximum deficit during a campaign and right after the day he won that he couldn't meet. And so the HST was...
And he said, go find the money.
He said, go find the money. And it was one of the options to prevent him from having to essentially blow his election promise on the budget. And he got around to the idea of it being good tax policy, which a lot of economists have said since. But they didn't do a great job selling it. They did a horrible job selling it. And Vander Zalm and Bill Thielman and others were able to kind of whip up voter discontent. And it's an amazing thing to look back on, you know, the use of that... the petition legislation, the recall legislation. It was never designed to work, and it was effectively done. And Campbell emerged badly damaged by the HST, and then a mutiny in his ranks. People who had felt like they'd been bullied by the other Gordon Campbell. There's two Gordon Campbells. There's the policy wonk reading Gordon Campbell, and there's the one who shouts in your face and spits at you behind a barn. Right? Yeah. And so when he was weak, the knives came out and they took him down. And we'd go a little bit into the machinations of how that happened. It's only interesting because many of the people who disliked Gordon Campbell and were mutineers in the end disliked Christy Clark when she came in and became mutineers at the beginning of her term. They just basically didn't like being told what to do.
I've seen, doing this job, I've seen Gordon Campbell forced out. I've seen Carol James forced out by her own party, an exceptionally vicious takedown. Clark, had she not gone, probably would have faced it. It was already starting. Glenn Clark had to go and left. Mike Harcourt had to go and left, and Van der Zalm. So actually the number of premiers I've covered who were forced out by their own people and the number of leaders exceeds the number of leaders who allowed themselves to be dispatched at the hands of the voters. So it's quite a province for that sort of thing. These guys have got their first book out of the most recent one, but you don't need to stick around too long. You'll have another one of these, I'll say it, but Horgan's doing just fine at the moment. Ken Wu has got a good question here. This is a question about the toughest decision Jorn Horgan has made so far and its impact. Here's Ken.
The BC NDP's decision to continue with the Site C dam, despite the fact that there is tremendous opposition from the conservation movement, from many First Nations, from local landowners in the north, has caused a rift within, I know, a section of the NDP membership, and I know that the Greens may be able to pick up quite a bit of support in certain ridings, particularly, I suspect, the Victoria area from the NDP. But I'm wondering, what do you think are the long-term ramifications, long-term being during this next 3 years electoral period, on the NDP in regards to its Site C decision?
Jorn Horgan said on this show last week that he does not think the impact is lasting. He said his mail has dropped off. It was a tough decision, but he said you make tough decisions and you move on. What do you think?
I think the Premier's probably right about that. I think he did it early enough in his mandate. There are other issues that matter more. Clearly, it could resonate on some ridings on Vancouver Island, but there are more important issues around affordability, childcare, transit, ones that are also plaguing Metro Vancouver that the NDP has said they're going to work on. If they don't fix those problems, they'll have trouble electorally. I think LNG will probably, or Site C will probably go away. I think, he fulfilled the promise to go to the BCUC. That was done, and I think, they're going to go ahead with Site C.
I think we're seeing this interesting evolution of Jorn Horgan. So he started as a guy who wanted to find that line between the environmental side of the NDP and the brown side of the NDP, the jobs and unionized jobs and natural resource projects. And then he didn't seem to be able to hold that line as an opposition leader. But he's come back to it now as a premier, approving the continuing construction on Site C, now making a play for the LNG industry, working with the trades. I think he's moving back to try and walk that line that he always wanted to walk. And we outlined what he said he wanted to do as leader before he ran for leader, was convinced to run for leader. And I think that's the premier that we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think if you only listen to the kinds of things he said to party supporters to get elected and the messaging there, which was careful, but if you listened only to that, you'd be surprised at what's happened. But, I've said it, he's been on this show 16 times. And on those 16 appearances, every one of his positions on Site C has been showcased. But pretty consistent all through that was support for LNG. So he does have his own hard hat, and he is a jobs guy, and he does come from the building trades supporting side of the party. So it's not that shocking a departure if you follow the whole career.
Right, I don't think so. And part of this is the knock on the NDP has long been, they say no to everything, they don't have any plans for job creation. Horgan desperately wants to show that he can create jobs, and those are jobs mainly, the easiest place to find them I think is in the resource sector. So that's I think why he's targeting the 10,000 jobs that would come with the LNG facility, $40 billion in investment. So I don't see it as much of a surprise that he's now shifting that way, and he's going to try to find other ways to create jobs as well.
Heading into the fall, for those of us who cover provincial politics, we're going to be busy with a big story. Here with a question about it, Bill Thielman.
Rob and Richard, one of the big questions we have coming up this year is the referendum on electoral systems in the fall. If proportional representation did pass, and I'm doing everything I can to stop that, what do you think the result would be on BC politics? How would they change?
Well, I think it would change significantly if we look at the way that it's worked in some other countries. You would have fewer majority governments. And some people argue that's a good thing, that absolute majorities, just by winning a few extra seats, ruling like a dictator for 4 years, is not representative of the public will. But, if if this book provides a glimpse behind the scenes at how a coalition is made, how a lieutenant governor has to intervene, that's the kind of thing you would see potentially more of if proportional representation passed. No party winning an absolute majority, deals behind the scenes on a confidence agreement, the LG having to make a call on, which party gets defeated in the House and how that works out, and if we have another election. And you could see this kind of year that we've gone through replay itself in the future much more often. It's very rare now, but I think it's the last time a government was defeated on a confidence vote and replaced by the opposition party without another election was 130 years ago. So we could see that almost every election if we moved to PR.
You interviewed the new Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia this week when she was appointed and reminded her that the job is not exactly a figurehead job. And if we get PR, it's going to be a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, you got to go into that job with your eyes wide open now because you're going to be called upon potentially to solve governments in the future.
It ain't just Boy Scout troops and pancake breakfast that you're going to be presiding over. So, yeah.
And one of the things I know that Bill's been raising in his campaign to stop proportional representation has been the emergence of fringe parties. I think that's something that's been untested a little bit in British Columbia. Those who are in favor of changing the electoral system don't believe that's much of a factor. Where that comes into play, right, are some regional seats that could potentially have one party that has one candidate or two candidates that are popular that have really extreme views either to the right or the left. So I think that would concern people if that's part of the electoral system. That could change BC politics if maybe that person or that party is the one that is holding the balance of power, but I'm not sure if that's really a reality in British Columbia.
Yeah, one of the things that jumps out to me just looking at the commentary on this is the number of people who assume that with PR what we would get is an endless series of governments just like the one we got last year, that it'll be Green NDP, that's where the majority vote is. But votes move around all the time. Yep. You could end up with a right-of-center coalition, other combinations. That certainly is the experience in other countries that have the system. However, we'll have a great debate about that when the fall rolls around, and you can bet Thielman will be in there with his oar in doing his usual job. I believe his record now is this will be his fourth referendum, and he won the previous three, so don't count him out. Maureen Karagianis, former MLA, Horgan supporter. Good question. Here she is.
So, Rob and Richard, I haven't read your book yet, but I am looking forward to it. My question for you is, what kind of wisdom do you think you would have? What kind of advice would you give if you could go back and tell Gordon Campbell or Christy Clark some things you'd learned from the book? And what kind of advice or recommendations do you give to current politicians and the Premier and Cabinet going forward?
This too shall pass.
It's always tough in our jobs to give advice. You know this. We're often asked by politicians, and you don't want to give them too much advice. But I think
we're really good at coming onto the field afterwards.
Yeah, right.
What they did wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. That's our job: is tell what they do wrong, not how to fix that. But I think the best advice is, to any politicians, tell the truth. Right? Be honest. Have a plan, stick with it. Be honest. Show your true self in a sense. I think that's what we learned through this book is those politicians that were themselves and stuck with who they were. Usually found success.
It's an interesting, and I'll just leave this question out here. It's an interesting, when we were writing this book, one of the questions is, what is Christy Clark's accomplishments in government compared to Gordon Campbell? And Gordon Campbell is viewed as this incredible policy wonk who unveiled a number of important changes in government policy, reconciliation and the carbon tax. But he ruled like a dictator. I mean, he was not kind to his cabinet or many of his MLAs or stories of people crying in this book. Christy Clark did not rule that way, and she did not pivot government like Gordon Campbell did every year on a new topic. And now you look back and you wonder, well, what did she do? And so I think there's a debate that could be had, it's what kind of government do you want to have? What kind of premier do you want to have? Do you need to change government on some new course every year to look like you accomplished something? Or does Christy Clark get any credit for years of balanced budgets during tough times, but not mega shifts in government policy? And that'll be one of the questions for historians, is to analyze the different governing styles and what produced the best outcomes for British Columbians.
Yeah, the book is a narrative of what happened in a time frame. You're right. I mean, it may take The book on what Dave Barrett did in government was published by Jeff Meggs, who's the Premier's Chief of Staff now, and Rod Mickelberg, who's a retired journalist. It only came out 3 or 4 years ago, right? So it went back 40 years and looked at something. And, with the passage of time, people may have a different view of Christy Clark or any number of other people. Here's a good question from Bruce Halser. You already referred to the dark Jorn Horgan. Here's Bruce Halser with a question about it.
Many of us who follow BC politics have long enjoyed Jorn Horgan's personality, his broad smile, and sometimes his nasty temper. He dealt with that issue head-on in the leaders' debates in the election, but we've missed that temper as he's been Premier. He's been all smiles. Do you think the temper is going to return at any time, or has it permanently been wiped from his psychological profile?
The nickname was Hulk Horgan, right? Because the Hulk is always just lurking underneath, ready to burst out at any moment. But we chronicle his transformation in the book, and you give a lot of credit to Marie Delamattia, who was a communications person brought in, who taught Horgan this lesson that he refused to learn for many, many years, and that is, even if you don't like the question, it's still an opportunity to talk about something you want to talk about. And he just railed against that for so many years, but he finally got around to, he used to combat the media on the premise of the question, and then he just figured out, I can just take it and use it to say what I want to say, and he transformed himself. And you got to give the guy full credit in the middle of the most stressful political period of his life in a provincial campaign of transforming his demeanor. And he does seem much happier now. He's much better. He can hold a press conference for half an hour and not, raise his voice at all. So it's an amazing transformation, I think.
That's what winning will do for you as well. And I think when things get tough, we may see Horgan get a bit frustrated. I never think we're going to see the Horgan we saw before the election. He was angry legitimately about a lot of policies he thought were huge injustices that had been done. And, I mentioned Roderick McIsaac earlier.
He's having a hard time with his own party.
Yeah, and the party was split in many different ways. So I think Horgan has changed. I think people have evolved with him. Sheena McConnell, his press secretary, is another person who's been with him now who helped control his temperament a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I love the bit in the book about 2 of his staffers who were known as the John Whisperers. That's nice, cute, affectionately, and also slightly satirically. Let's go to Troy Sebastian. This is a good one as well.
With so many changes in BC politics over the last few years, from a BC Liberal government to an NDP government, do you ever see the possibility of a BC Green government coming to British Columbia?
With a change to the electoral system, I think anything can happen. The Greens have to, build a structure and a party. A lot of winning elections is about getting on the road and meeting voters and engaging with voters. And, with social media now, that's becoming much easier. We haven't seen, the election in 10, 20 years from now is going to be much different than the one 10, 20 years before it because of engaging with voters and how they connect. People are watching less television, reading less newspapers. They're consuming Facebook and social media, Instagram more. So, we could see a party like the Greens use that as well as a bigger infrastructure. They now have more money because they're an official party
and
that will help public funding. So all of that will help, and we could potentially see over time, it not be a strange idea for a Green government.
Quickly, I want to get one more question in, Bruce Halser.
Since she resigned as Premier, we really haven't seen anything of Christy Clark. She's a fairly young person with lots of energy. What do you think she's going to do in her future, and do you think there's any new career ahead for her in politics?
What do you think?
Well, politics is such a blood sport. Gordon Campbell got exiled over the HST. He hasn't been able to work here in years. And Christy Clark's facing a bit of that too. The tribute she got at the Liberal Leadership Convention was almost non-existent. You have to wonder what a board would get appointing her to the board now with an NDP government. And yet she's extremely skilled in many, many different ways.
The Democrats won't even admit that Ujjal Dosanjh was the leader of the party and a premier. Right?
Yeah.
It's true. They tend to get pushed so far into the background you never hear from them again.
I see her running a very successful organization at some point, but you got to wait till the dust settles a little bit in BC.
Yeah. And Gordon Campbell, you're right, is still, he lives in Ottawa still, doesn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
Been back. Mike Harcourt's still around. Everybody sees him. Glenn Clark is doing very well.
Yeah, he is, for sure.
Vander Zand being completely shameless is wherever you want to see him, right?
Yeah.
And all that true. Well, listen, gentlemen, I am really glad you got this book done, and good luck on the book tour. Good luck with the sales. I know you're checking Amazon every 5 minutes, so
yeah. Well, thank you for your help, Vaughn. You're a big inspiration, and you helped us a lot.
But no, it's really appreciated. And look, best of luck with the book, folks. It is called A Matter of Confidence. And you can actually find it at your bookstore. And other than an odd choice of judgment, which is they put my endorsement on the back page below that of a former prime minister, and I won't say which one it is. Otherwise, it's just a fine book, and there are no flaws in it whatsoever. So, look, it's a real pleasure. Thanks very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Vaughn.
Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature of BC politics into your living room. Good night.
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and